Hello and a very warm welcome indeed to Quadriga, coming to you from the heart of the German capital, Berlin. And this week we're looking at the latest developments in the war in Syria, where the focus is very much on the embattled city of Aleppo. In recent days, the city once known as the jewel of Syria has seen some of the most horrific fighting in the five-year-old conflict. 250,000 people are under siege. There are allegations of barbarism and war crimes. Local medical staff say they simply cannot cope with the overwhelming number of casualties. One first responder said of the situation in Aleppo, "There is no escape. It feels like the end of the world." So here on Quadriga, we're going to be talking about the suffering of the people of Syria and the response of the international community. And to do so, I'm joined here in the studio by three Syria specialists, beginning with Osama Felix Darah. He is a German Syrian author and activist based here in Berlin. And he says what is happening in Syria is an abomination and will continue as long as Washington refuses to exercise strategic leadership. Also with us is Kristin Hellberg, who's a widely published commentator on Syria. She's convinced that the path to peace in Syria goes through Moscow. And we're joined too by DW's own Maysoon Melem. She was born in Syria and says it's not Aleppo that is the real cause for shame, but the suffering of all the Syrian people and the fact that the international community has been in denial for so long. Well, Maysoon Melem, I'd like to begin with you. You were born in Syria, and we have tended in recent times to act as though the conflict in your country could not get any worse. Now it seems to be there is a definite escalation. What are your thoughts and what are your feelings?
Well, you know, you start your day with a cup of coffee and somehow a feeling of satisfaction that your child is sleeping in his bedroom, and you start reading the news, and the first thing you see, like what I saw today, a bunch of children swimming in a crater, an explosion crater, resulted from the bombings of yesterday. Filled with the water of the broke water supply, which the civilians living in Aleppo don't have anymore. And you scroll down, and then you see Bashar al-Jafari laughing at the UN, the ambassador of the Syrian regime at the UN, laughing when a journalist asked him... It was a shocking moment, truly a shocking moment. Ask him, Mr. Ambassador, did you target the two hospitals yesterday? So he just laughed and walked away. And you think, well, it's been... It's been like moving from bad to worse for the last 5 years, and unfortunately, it's not getting the worst. I mean, every day we reach a worse condition. I don't know if it's going to have an end in any time soon. Mm-hmm.
Kristin Hellberg, after 5 years of this, 5.5 years now of the conflict in Syria, Staffan de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy to Syria, he's spoken out and said that we are now witnessing new heights of horror. What can you tell us from your personal contacts?
It's definitely a new escalation, and I always thought, as you probably all thought, that it's not possible. It cannot get any worse, but it's getting worse. And we're only looking at Aleppo. We have other places where people are besieged for 4 years now that we are not even look at. You know, we have the strategy of the Assad regime to besiege people, to bomb them continuously, to starve them out. You know, and this all works because Bashar al-Assad himself and the Russians now know that they can do whatever they want. They can use the bombs and the weapons that they have because nobody will interfere and stop them. So this is the major problem right now.
OK, before we bring you in, Osama, let's just listen to two voices of people who are trapped in Aleppo at this current time.
I call on honourable people to come and help us. We're dying with the blockade, the destruction and the killing. May God hold these people to account.
Which country did we rise up against? We're simple people. We've committed no crime. The entire world, including Russia and America, is crushing us.
Osama Felix Darah, that's very, very moving testimony directly from Aleppo. I've noticed in the last couple of days a lot of people have been comparing the situation in Aleppo with the situation in Guernica in 1937, just in the build-up to the Second World War. And people have also been talking about what happened in Dresden in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, the terrible firebombing of that city. How useful are those kind of comparisons?
Well, I think they are useful comparisons to put a context there. I mean, if you want to look at Guernica or Dresden, they were destroyed in a fairly quickly in a matter of several weeks. But in Aleppo or in other places in Syria that have been besieged, for example, in Dareya in southern Damascus, here you have a civilian population of 6,000 to 8,000 people with 600 fighters that were besieged literally for 3 years. And they could only survive because they have their independent water supply. The old Arabic houses have very deep wells, and they're really into urban gardening. But in terms of the context of the horror we see now in Aleppo, this is a very long, protracted situation. So it would be comparable to what happened in Warsaw when the Nazis besieged the city there, or the Jewish quarter there. It only held out for 21 days. Now, Aleppo has the stamina and the willpower, I think, to withstand for many months. So what we are seeing is definitely comparable to that, but it is on a much larger scale, and it's like dying in slow motion.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the level of the suffering, how important is it as well to point to the kind of weaponry that is now being used, cluster bombs and etc., napalm and bunker busters and incendiary bombs? How important is all that now?
Well, how important is it? I mean, these are weapons that we've seen. We have a regime that has unfolded its complete conventional military arsenal, and we have a White House that has said we have international norms that have to be respected and enforced. There was a red line drawn, but not enforced. The murder weapon was taken away, but he was not punished for it in terms of chemical weapons. And then the UN started a process in which the regime became a partner in a disarmament process. And now, 2-3 years later, we see statements from the White House saying the use of chemical weapons has become routine in Syria. I think it shows that we have to go much deeper here, that the very foundations of the international system as we know it, as we knew it since the Second World War, is fraying. It's falling apart.
Maysoon, you are nodding.
Well, I do agree with him, especially when I always get disappointed that not only these red lines are not enforced, Bashar al-Assad and the representative of this regime, which is doing all the atrocities which we are witnessing right now, he gets interviewed by international journalists like every couple of weeks. So he is given the chance to justify his war crimes in front of all our cameras after doing all his crimes also in front of our cameras. So I really don't understand it. And these journalists come usually from the US, from the West, not even from Russia, who is obviously supporting the regime.
Well, I think we have to take into consideration that the Syrians are really paying a price for a misled Western foreign policy of the last 10 to 15 years. It's not that simple. You know, if you look at the American record in the region, obviously there was a lot of mistakes. You had an invasion in Iraq that was the birth moment kind of Daesh, of the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State. Then we had Obama coming to the White House saying that I don't want to go for any military adventure here. I only want to get American soldiers home. So this was the second catastrophe for the Syrians, because then we didn't have any chance to engage militarily to the only aim of protecting civilians. It's not about regime change here, and I don't want to compare it to Iraq because it did not happen. There's no Western regime change. If there were any governments who wanted to do this, they would have millions of reasons to do it, you know, talking about the red lines. But we don't have this here. We have a US administration and a European continent that is not able to formulate any kind of common foreign policy. So we really left Syria to Russia. They took the chance. They engaged very much, even militarily. So this is why we are now at a point that we have to realize, if we like it or not, that it's the Russians whom we need to convince how to get to a future inside Syria. And this means that we have to have kind of a negotiated transition without Bashar al-Assad in the end. So the Russians have to understand that this is in their very interest, because the engagement and the war in Syria is very expensive for the Russians, and it's not popular at home, and the Russians cannot own Syria. It's just too big for them. So it's in their very interest to get to this point, to make a transition, an organized transition away from the Assad regime, with elements of the opposition, with elements of this regime that have not blood on their hands, as they say.
Yeah.
And we have to convince Vladimir Putin of exactly that, because without him, it's not possible.
But how? I mean, we have been watching peace talks directly between the Americans and the Russians for the last, I don't know how many months now.
It seems he's
What
not
else
interested
did the
right now.
West
That's the problem. So maybe we need a military balance here. That's the question. Do we need to engage militarily for a no-fly zone to stop at least the bombing of civilians unilaterally from the West? Do we need this? Everybody's afraid of escalation. Everybody is afraid of a third world war with the Russians. But will it not maybe be a step to get out of this spiral of violence? Maybe it's the first step out.
You see, this is exactly what was tried in Geneva in the first 6 months of this year. The opposition was there. They had 3 rounds of peace talks. And of course, there's several tracks, and it's exactly as you said. This is what the goal is, to take the remnants of state institution, civil servants who have no blood on their hand, and to try to go for some type of an interim government and a military council to disarm and so forth. But I think there's a huge problem here. If you see that diplomacy fails, that has a huge, huge price. It doesn't occur in a vacuum. And if you frankly look at the U.S. position here, going into Geneva, they have a plan A, and they declare that every day. There's no alternative to diplomacy. But if you don't have a plan B, if you don't have a credible threat of anything, plan A cannot work. And I'll tell you why. Because the Russian ambition grows with their perception of weakness in the White House. And of course, it's not so easy, as you mentioned also. I mean, Russia, its economy is about the size of Spain now. It's in free fall. Their foreign currency reserves have fallen from, I guess, 130, 140 billion down to 20% of that now, perhaps even less. They don't want to swallow Syria. They can't, and they're fighting 2 hybrid wars in the Ukraine and in Syria at the same time. So you have to have some type of a balance there, so that each side can even opt and sense how far they might be able to go in order to just consolidate the situation. And we're nowhere near that, because the Europeans, frankly, I think they can formulate a coherent policy, but it's only coherent in terms of what the lowest common denominator is. I mean, we spoke of barbarism. Last Saturday, the Security Council met on Syria, and a very interesting exchange of blows there. The U.S. said Russia is responsible. They called their actions barbaric. The Germans did not do that. They waited and followed the American line. And when the Europeans came out with their statement, Ms. Mogherini, 2 days later, she didn't mention any culprits at all. She just said that that's very disconcerting. So it shows there that there's no military component at all. And I think that's just the opposite of what we learned conventional diplomacy to be. As Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly, but carry a big stick.
OK, I'd like to pick up on the word diplomacy before we move on with the conversation. Let's just listen to what 4 of the top international diplomats have had to say in recent days.
Imagine the destruction. People with their limbs blown off, children in a terrible pain with no relief, infected, suffering, dying, with nowhere to go and no end in sight. Imagine a slaughterhouse.
What Russia is sponsoring and doing is not counterterrorism, it is barbarism.
As a result, in Syria, hundreds of groups are being armed, the territory of the country is being bombed indiscriminately, and bringing peace is almost an impossible task now.
There is a failure of the international community. That's what the Syrians are saying, and they are right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The people of Syria are saying that the international community has let them down. I know that you say the international community is in denial. Tell me more.
Well, as I said, this drama we are watching on TV now is more than about just Aleppo. It's been like this in Homs like for 2 years or 3 years even, from 2011, where there wasn't any Islamists or jihadists in Syria till 2014. That was like this in Daraya and Muaddamiyeh. And as Osama said, the Syrian regime did many things or crossed many red lines, which was drawn by the international community or by the US, and wasn't even asked about it. We heard only rhetorics from them. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, a convoy of aid organization or some aids going to the civilians in Aleppo was targeted by Russia, and no one even raised an eyebrow about it.
Kristin Hellberg, the question there is, how can one deal with Russia if Russia is responsible for barbarism and for war crimes and for destabilization?
Yes, I mean, it really, the last week, it seemed quite cynical. You know, they were all sitting there around in New York trying to go back to any kind of truce. And at the same time, it was really the Russians itself bombing East Aleppo. It seemed very much, cynical from a Syrian point of view. But again, we won't be able to find a solution without the Russians, because they are there. They had their own goals in Syria. I would argue that Vladimir Putin kind of reached his goals already. He wants to be perceived as a world power, as a regional power that is very crucial to the region. He wants to make sure that the American century is over in the Middle East. You know, that he's a very important player there. He wants to make sure that his own military bases will be at Tartus, at the coastal side. I think this is all what he needed from Syria. So now it would be the time for him to realize that if he wants to kind of influence the post-war era and who comes and who follows the Assad regime, it would be really now the moment to ask Bashar al-Assad to step aside. The problem is, who's going to tell this to Vladimir Putin, and why is he not realizing this? I feel that at the moment the deal between Assad and Putin is this. Assad says, okay, we will let some humanitarian aid convoys pass, because this is what we are seeing at the same time. We have several cities that received some help during the last week. At the same time, he really wants to go back to East Aleppo. He really wants to take East Aleppo. He has tried this several times. He was stopped by the Russians. This time he says, we will finish this. We are so close. So the Russians will help them in this, with the hope that after this new election in the US, because that's the biggest fear of Staffan de Mistura, the UN convoy, he said that, you know, this conflict will be frozen for 3 to 4 months, because nobody will engage and will think about any international initiative without a new US president. So this is really dramatic, because the Russians will help Assad to fortify his position militarily on the ground, and then everybody has to wait until February, probably 2017, until any other international initiative will be pronounced.
But did I understand you right, that the Russians are not able to impose their word on Assad?
They could, but they don't seem interested. I think they are doing this.
So they are waiting for him to get back the city, or the part of the city which is held by the rebels now, and be satisfied, and then they might talk to him.
Yes, I think
this is what you are. Okay.
Yes, I think this would be possible.
If I can just make a comment here, it's really interesting that when we speak to the Russians, we say your problem is that the guy that you're protecting is the worst war criminal we've seen for a very, very long time, and this rubs off on you. And he's also very weak on the ground. I mean, the Syrian army is only legally carrying this title. It's basically dissolved into a bunch of warlords. And we see the results with the last so-called elections in Syria. The parliament is full of these warlords. It's not the Ba'ath Party anymore. It's just all these thugs there now, and traitors who were funding some front. But the army itself cannot hold a single front.
This is, by the way, what Russian militaries or Russian generals just say.
A lot of them really complain about this. I mean, look what we got ourselves into. Now, the other aspect is what is happening on the ground here. If we say the international community should balance out something, it's just not going to happen without Hillary Clinton, right? And the opposition is already speaking to Hillary Clinton. She has a Syria task force, 6 or 7 people. And basically reassessing her options means what? Means trying to separate the Free Syrian Army, which is there. They have tens of thousands of people. They're in the north, they're in the central and part of Syria, and in the south.
It's not an army, though.
It's not an army, it's an idea. It's the idea of a revolution and of an army that keeps its oath that it swore to protect the fatherland and Syrian citizens, right? which nobody does in the Syrian army now. But the problem that I see, we have from now until February, say Hillary wins, what is going to happen in this interval now? And this is where Putin is going all in, trying to destroy Aleppo. This will give him a much stronger negotiating position. And what it means for the international community is that Syrians are saying, well, as a matter of fact, Jabhat al-Nusra and these jihadists on the ground are a morally stronger force than the international community. They give their lives to break. I mean, this is what they see. Yeah. They feed us and so forth. This is a huge problem.
Okay, we talk about the Americans, we talk about the Russians. Maisin, what about Bashar al-Assad and his supporters? I mean, I guess that down the years you've had plenty of opportunities to listen to what they have to say, and I'd be interested to hear how that sounds to you at this point in time, because they too are the Syrian people.
Yeah, they are. Well, as any other part in Syria, there are some extremists there living in the region where Bashar al-Assad still have the control of. But many people are just tired from this war, from this long-term war, and they are just stuck there, hoping to leave the country, even if they support Bashar al-Assad, whether they just hope to leave the country and leave it behind and survive with their souls and children. And I mean, like many other who we hear from them the same statement we've been hearing for the last 5 years. What might be the alternative if Bashar al-Assad went? And now it's about their existence there. I mean, after the wars being between jihadis and Shiite militants, and after it's become a sectarian war, they are just defending their existence there or trying to leave the country.
And I mean, it really has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, Bashar al-Assad, from his very first speech in
they invented at the beginning, but they are suffering under it right now.
And conspiracy and foreign terrorists coming to the country, which was ridiculous. Everybody was laughing about this, and then
but they were not laughing. But they were not laughing. They believed it from the first moment.
Yeah, but now they see that on the other side you have all these jihadis. So in the end, yes, Bashar al-Assad is supposed to protect me from these people. I think a lot of his supporters, or people who just hold still, you know, who don't move, they are afraid, and I think that they just feel, you know, let's not move. I mean, they are afraid of the Assad regime, of the secret services there, obviously, but they are afraid of the future as well. So they tend to believe what he's telling them. You know,
and by the way, they're even afraid of serving the army. So they support him, but they wouldn't like to fight in his army.
There's something that I'd like to add here. I mean, it's true, of course, you know, this is his self-fulfilling prophecy, Assad, you know, to destroy all the moderates, so the world has to choose between him and basically ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whoever. And the Syrians are stuck with people saying, look, these guys protect us. We don't share their vision for a future Syria at all. They don't even use the word Syria, true jihadists. But he's the only one protecting me now. Where is the world? And when I speak of the interval until the next US president hopefully decides to make a move, there's a very important point. You see, 80% of Syria are hard-to-reach areas. You have, according to the Geneva designation, you have 18 or 19 besieged areas, and 80% are hard to reach. Those are almost exclusively provided for by Syrian civil society, which is still alive. And what I'm afraid of is that not only the political discourse and the negotiations are actually sort of, you know, trying to find a meeting of interests between the great powers and the neighboring countries. The Syrians are shrinking away from this process. I just don't see them as strongly. I don't see them being consulted. I mean, how can you have a process there and a cessation of hostility based on an agreement that you do with Russia as the US, that you don't consult with your allies and your friends with? I mean, you're doing this for the Syrian people, aren't you? You know, it just seems to a lot of Syrians that they're improving their bilateral relations at our costs, and it shouldn't be so.
Talking about the Syrian people, and we made shame in the international community one of the topics, one of the focal points of this discussion. Pope Francis talks about the globalization of indifference towards Syria. 30 seconds on that phrase.
I think the UN or the international community has not only let Syria down in terms of war or bombing, but the humanitarian aid is not being delivered to people there because the UN has really lost their impartiality and their neutrality inside Syria. It's the Assad regime who dictates who gets the help, and 96% of the food help, for example, reaches only Assad's area. So we have to go back to a stronger standing there.
The globalization of indifference.
I would really say, sadly, the sentence you told me before the show, injustice has become a part of our moral system.
The last word?
I would just ask the European states to not think in terms of their national interests and their national agenda. If you really want to help the Syrian people, you invest in civil society. It's still alive and it's the future of Syria.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. I've got to say thank you very, very much to all of my guests. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for joining us here on Quadriga. Do come back next week. Until then, bye-bye and tschüss.